From New Hampshire Public Radio and the Howe Library in Hanover, New Hampshire, you're listening to Check This Out, a series where we dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. I'm your host, Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna. I am thrilled to be able to share these conversations with you. This is the very first episode of Season 3, and I'm excited to be back. We have a brand new slate of exciting books and authors coming your way this fall. Today, my guest is Marjan Kamali, and we will be discussing her new novel, The Lion Women of Tehran. This book transports us to Iran, to a time when the country was open, when women could wear what they wanted and dream of becoming anything. Kamali paints a brilliant picture of a time filled with hope and just the hint of fear that it could all come crashing down. The novel starts in the 1950s when two girls, Ellie and Homa, meet and become best friends. The book follows them over the next several decades as their lives diverge and braid back together. Rich descriptions of the bazaar, the smells, the foods, and Tehran itself made me feel like I was in the city with these girls, struggling to understand not only the betrayal that rocks their friendship and lives, but also the betrayal both girls feel when the country and freedom they know and love disappears, replaced by harsh laws that quash women's rights, human rights, and dreams. When Ayatollah Khomeini returns to Iran and assumes his role as the first supreme leader, Kamali shows us how quickly everything can change, how quickly dreams shatter. This book is full of love, friendship, and heartbreak. It's also teeming with history and will make you feel like you are living through the revolution with Ellie and Homa. Throughout it all, the question I kept asking was around the fragility of freedom. How fragile is freedom? Freedom to be, to love, to live. And how quickly and how easily do we make mistakes that change the course of our lives? Marjan, welcome to Check This Out. I'm really excited to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm so excited to be with you.
I absolutely loved your novel, The Lion Women of Tehran. It is brilliant, it is gorgeous, and I want to jump right in by talking about Iran.
Yes.
When I think about Iran today, I think about some scary things, if I'm being honest. I think about women who recently have been arrested, beaten, and killed for violating hijab rules. I think about morality police. I think about government control. But this is not where your book starts. Your book starts in a different time. You really take us back to a piece of Iran's history that I think has been buried and lost for a lot of people. So can you take us back to where you start in this novel?
Absolutely. I agree with you, Rachel, that for so many people, when they think of Iran today, it is those scary images that are conjured up. And that's because so many of those realities are super difficult to digest, to even believe. But Iran is a country that changed so very drastically in the 20th century. And that's why I want to capture, in some ways, the way it was in all its complexities, and not to pretend that the way it was perfect either, because it had its own problems, which led to the reason why it is the way it is. But I start the book, well, the story of the friendship of Ellie and Homa starts in 1950. And I deliberately wanted to spend time in the 50s, spend time in the 60s and the 70s, because these are 3 decades when, despite some other difficulties that were being experienced, and I tried to also address those and not sugarcoat them, but as far as women's rights were concerned, women were seeing an expansion in their rights. In the 50s, in the early 60s, they got the right to vote. Marriage, divorce laws, and reproductive rights, all of those laws were changed to benefit women. And women of my mom's generation saw this huge breathing space, this huge expansion of their rights. And in the 70s, that continued. But then when the regime changed, when it came to women's rights, those rights were drawn back and taken away. And it felt like it was almost overnight. And no one could believe it could happen there, because it was at that time one of the most progressive countries when it came to women's rights in that region. Everybody was at first in denial that it could happen. And then when it did happen, they were in shock.
It's fascinating to think about Iran from this time period, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the women in your book, or the girls, Ellie and Homa, go to university. And this is actually one right that still exists. And after the regime changed, women were still permitted to attend universities. And I understand that attendance actually increased for women. Is that right?
Yeah, it did. It actually increased. And part of the reason is that by the 70s, a lot of families were feeling uncomfortable with the rate of change in Iran, with this growing westernization. And so some more religious conservative families didn't want to send their girls to university because they felt that it would be like a hotbed of too much mixing of the genders and progressive ideas. And so, because the regime changed, universities became segregated. And due to the fact that after the regime took a strong foothold, dress codes for women were changed such that they had to cover themselves in a very strange way. This made some families more comfortable with sending their daughters to school because they felt that it was quote unquote safer because they'd be covered and they'd be segregated. So that's where that comes from. That's how that happened. Yeah.
It's really fascinating. So, before we dig even further into politics and the book and this beautiful story, clearly your connection here is very personal. Can you tell us about your background and your connection to Iran and these girls in your amazing book?
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of people assume that I grew up in Iran because I write about it, and they assume that some of these experiences are my own. Well, here's the truth. I lived in Iran between the ages of 2 and 5, and again between age 9 and 10 and a half. And if you think about that in the scope of my life, that is a very small percentage. So I didn't live there very long, but that is precisely why I write about it, because I grew up, like you said, Rachel, with this image of Iran that was on television where you saw a lot of right wing fanatics just constantly having one version of life and the law that they seem to espouse. That's what I would see when I turned on any kind of media. And then I would have my parents tell me about this country that they grew up in. And the two countries could not be more different. So I've spent a lot of time researching and reconciling how these two different places can be the same, if you know what I mean. And I have an endless curiosity for the history of Iran and just the mystery of it, to also uncover, for any country, how can it change so much? How can a country go from being X to being Y? And that's not unique to Iran, but in Iran, I mean, obviously, it's just so visible. The changes are so drastically, they hit the eye. So my connection to Iran is that I lived there for a very short time, but both my parents were born and raised there. And so the reason I write about this country is because I am trying to figure it out. And it also gave me an excuse to talk to my parents at great length.
Do you have any family that's still there?
I have some. I had a huge extended family, and a lot of my family left in the early 1980s, which is when a lot of people left right after the revolution. And actually, during the start of that war, there was an 8-year war between Iran and Iraq in the 1980s that we don't talk about a lot. But I talk about it sometimes in my books because I lived there for the first year and a half of that war. And most of my family is no longer there, but I still have a couple of aunts and a couple of cousins. Yeah.
Would you mind sharing the circumstances under which your family left or how they left?
So, I think a lot of people initially, when the revolution happened, people had hope because they thought, now we're going to have a democracy. And there was this sense of, we're going to get it right. But that quickly changed. It quickly became clear that the country was going in a very different direction. We mostly left for two reasons. One was the war. Most people don't enjoy living through a war. And most people, when they spend night after night after night in the basement as bombs fall outside, especially if you have children, as my parents did, eventually think, we don't want to live this way because we could die like this. So the war was a big reason. And another reason was that my dad has been, from my entire lifetime, disabled basically and very sick. And so another reason we left was for him to get medical care. So those were the main two reasons we left, but it felt supremely abrupt. And when I arrived in New York City at the age of 10, I was well aware of the people I had left behind. And I knew I had to live doubly hard for myself and for my best friend.
This brings us into the novel because we have this best friend story. And I would love it if you could read a page for us so we can get a little taste of the book.
Yes, I thought about what to read, and then I thought, let's start at the very beginning, as Julie Andrews likes to say, because if I read for you the first page, then you don't need any context. So if you were to pick this book up, yes, at your favorite independent bookshop, and just turn to page 1.
Perfect.
So, chapter 1, December 1981. I stood on the lacquered floor, a small woman in black with a rectangular name badge on my chest. My coiffed, contented look was calculated so I'd appear not just satisfied, but quietly superior. In America, I'd learned the secret to being a successful salesperson was to act like one of the elite, as if spritzing perfume on customers' blue-veined wrists was doing them a favor. A sea of haughty New Yorkers swerved to avoid my spray. Thank God for the more down-to-earth women, the cooks and bakers coming up to the first floor from the basement home goods section. They were too polite to reject the fragrant droplets I offered. Orange, lily, jasmine, and rose notes nestled in the lines of my palms and the fiber of my clothes. Look at you, Ellie. Soon you'll take over this whole brand. I better watch my back. My friend and coworker Angela, returning from her cigarette break, sidled up and whispered in my ear. The scent of her Hubba Bubba gum couldn't hide the smoke on her breath. I shivered at the reek of tobacco. The bitter, sour notes would forever remind me of one long ago night in Iran. The night when an act of betrayal changed the entire course of my friendship with Homa and both of our lives. From the moment I'd read Homa's letter last night, I'd been a wreck. I batted away Angela's compliments, said I wasn't doing all that well, really, and that I had a headache because I hadn't eaten all day. I just might faint, I added with a touch of melodrama. It was a relief when Angela was whisked away by a needy customer. My mother always said the envy of others invites the evil eye to cast doom on us. She'd often told me that being perceived as too competent, happy, or successful could summon misfortune. I knew belief in the powers of other people's jealousy and the jinxing of an evil eye needed to be cast off. But at the age of 38, in the middle of that massive Manhattan department store, I was still unwittingly beholden to superstition. The truth of who I was could not be escaped, nor could the flaw I had spent years trying to quash and erase. The guilty one had always been me.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Marjan Kamali, and you're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Marjan's brand new novel, The Lion Women of Tehran. Marjan, this novel is about a love between friends, Ellie and Homa. I also read it as a love between you and Iran. Even more, I read it as a warning about how quickly governments can change, how quickly you can lose your freedom and what you love. Did you intend for that warning to be there? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, since the book came out, I've been asked if my intention was for the warning to be there. To be honest with you, when I was writing the book, I was so solely focused on the loss of rights for women in Iran because it is so drastic. And I was doing my research and getting to know Ellie and Homa, and then Ellie and Homa took over the page, and I was living through Homa, through what she lost, through what Ellie lost. Now that the book is out, people ask me if it's a warning call for the US, and they tell me I can relate. I can relate. And Rachel, the honest truth is, it shocks me because when my first novel came out, when Together Tea came out, and I wrote about the loss of women's rights, in book clubs, people would talk to me as if I was writing about some alien place, and they couldn't relate, but they could relate to the characters just through the characters' experience. And now it breaks my heart to hear people here in the United States say, I worry this is happening or that it could happen here. And my response to that is, it can happen anywhere at any time. I live under no illusion that freedom is guaranteed because I've seen it. I've experienced it taken away. And I'm well aware of what you said, the fragility of freedom. And I'm well aware that rights are not a given. We constantly, in a way, have to fight for them to stay. So while it wasn't my intention for it to be a warning, that is indeed how readers are receiving it, a lot of them.
And does writing this book, being so open and frank about that fragility of freedom and what happened is happening in Iran, does that put you in any danger or your family in any danger?
It may. I don't feel I'm saying anything that isn't true. But then again, speaking the truth is often not a favored thing of autocratic regimes. All I know is that women and girls in Iran were out in the streets, particularly in the fall of 22 and beyond, and men joining them, to fight for their rights, and a lot of them were killed. And the least I can do is try to shed some light on what it is they were trying to say. And I very much hope it doesn't put me in danger, but it's hard to predict. It's hard to predict because with autocracy, there's no rhyme or reason. I just feel though, as writers, we do have a responsibility to speak about what's going on in our societies. I feel that very strongly, and I can't help but do it. Because if I were to write about these women without addressing these issues, I feel I would be doing them a huge disfavor, and I just can't even imagine doing that.
I mean, writing is powerful. That's why people ban books.
Correct. That's right. Because I feel through fiction, you can actually say so much more about reality in some ways, because fiction has a way of connecting to people and settling into their hearts and letting them see not just what happened. You know, it's that famous E.L. Doctorow quote, history shows us what happened, but fiction shows us how what happened made people feel. And showing how what happened made people feel is a very, very powerful thing.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Marjan Kamali, and we are talking about her brand new novel, The Lion Women of Tehran. You're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. Marjan, at the core of this new novel, this beautiful new novel, is a friendship between two girls, Homa and Ellie. Can you talk about that friendship and where it starts?
Sure. The friendship between Homa and Ellie starts when they meet one another in first grade. They're 7 years old, and it's 1950 in Tehran. And this friendship is formed even though they come from different backgrounds, they come from different stations in life, different economic classes, you could say, though Ellie's privilege has been temporarily halted by the death of her father, and she has to move to a neighborhood that's a lot less wealthy than the one she was used to. What I wanted to do, Rachel, is I wanted to capture the texture of friendship, the joy of having a companion. I remember so physically, so viscerally, the friendships I had when I was a little girl, and just the joy that came with something like playing hopscotch together or doing homework together, going to your friend's house for the first time, meeting their mom, seeing this other way a family can live. I just wanted to capture girlhood, girlhood with all its carefreeness, its joy, that kind of exciting moment when you discover something new for the first time with your friend, where you expand your horizons with your friend, where you go on an adventure together. and just that comfort that having a friend provides. It doesn't mean the world is less cruel. It doesn't mean bad things don't happen, and Lord knows they do happen in the Lion Women of Tehran. But it just means that you have someone with whom to weather the storm, someone to talk to, someone to giggle with, someone to just sit in silence with. And so it was really important to me to capture those facets of friendship.
It also was a way for you to show that side of Iran. These girls are hopeful. They look to a future. They're free to run around and, go buy ice cream in the bazaar and, in a fun trip adventure that they took. It was a really beautiful moment of childhood that you captured in the beginning of the book.
Yes, and I was trying to show exactly that, the promise, that idea that that generation had, where at age 7, at age 10, when they sit on the ledge and have that ice cream sandwich in the bazaar, the part you're mentioning, Homa asks Ellie, basically, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And the world is now open to them. And Ellie is surprised in a way that she can say just about anything. And I did want to show what it meant for girls of that generation to know that they could go places no generation before them had gone. And if I may add, Rachel, the truth, which is now that generation is in their 70s, early 80s, and they have to live with the fact that the freedoms they had growing up are not available to their daughters and to their granddaughters. This idea that they had these opportunities available to them now that were so new and exciting. I wanted to show that in a conversation Ellie and Homa have one day when they're skipping school and they go to the bazaar. And I deliberately had them skipping school and going to the bazaar for two reasons. One, because it shows them physically expanding their world. They're actually running toward a place and going through streets and avenues they haven't ever been in. So there's that physical manifestation of this expansion of their horizons. But two, because my mom told me a story of one day skipping school with her friend and going to the bazaar. So it was like a combined issue there. But this is Homa speaking to Ellie when they're 10. What job do you want to have? Job? Yes. Do you want to be a teacher, a nurse, a lawyer, maybe a doctor? You're so good at science. I just wanted to eat my ice cream. Not sure, I mumbled. Tell me. A mother, I said, my mouth full. Yes, yes, but women can work too, in a just society. Did you know we could be the first generation of women fully working in Iran? There are women working in Iran now. Not that many, and not in more high up jobs. We'll do that, won't be.
And that is exactly this hope. But also, you have woven into the background of that hope quiet suggestions that maybe this could come crashing down, because you very clearly make the division between Ellie's background, right, the haves or, one slice of society, and Homa's, right, who's from the poorer side. And then also we have Homa's father is a communist. Talk about that.
Well, I made him a communist on purpose because you can't really understand where Iran is today without understanding the communist movement in Iran and without understanding the influence of Russia on Iran. So the Soviet Union and Iran actually shared a border. There was a lot of ins and outs and migration and movement and a lot of Russian influence in Iran. And there was a very strong communist movement in Iran in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. You can't really discount the power of that communist movement because it was the fear of Iran becoming a communist country that led the United States and Dwight E. Eisenhower to help a coup occur in 1953 that overthrew the democratically elected prime minister, because the worry was so strong that Iran would become communist that they were willing to sort of solidify the power of the Shah, and then the Shah became stronger and stronger, which then led to a backlash, which led to 1979. So I know I'm getting into the weeds here, but the communist movement had a lot to do with why Iran is the way it is today. So I made Homa's dad a communist. He is arrested under the Shah's regime because under the monarchy, when Iran, had the Shah, they had the king, it was a monarchy. The communists were a big threat. And it was a very strange alliance that helped lead to the overthrow of the Shah. The communists ended up almost allying with the hard right religious fundamentalists, which is, if you think about it, very ironic. But that's what led to the overthrow of the Shah. And we forget about the Russian influence in Iran, and we forget about just how strong it used to be. And to this day, there's so many remains of it. And it's a big part of the culture too. Like one of the foods that Ellie and Homa eat that they love when they are in high school, and even when they're in university, they go off to Cafe Andre and they have salad olivia sandwiches, which are absolutely delicious and my absolute favorite sandwich in the planet Earth. And this is a beloved, beloved sandwich in Iran, beloved dish. It came to Iran from Russia. Now it's almost like a national dish, but it's just one small example of the cultural influences.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Marjan Kamali, and you're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Marjan's brand new novel, The Lion Women of Tehran. And we are talking right now about the communist influence in Iran in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And we see when the book opens that one of the main characters, Homa, she has a father who's a communist, who's arrested. And then she sort of takes up that communist cause as the girls grow up and she goes to university. So can you just talk about how she grows into that and how she assumes that from her father?
Homa is such an idealist. She's that person in your life who not only talks the talk, but walks the walk. And she believes so strongly in equity, in justice. And she becomes a communist, I think, because she's very young and perhaps she's influenced by her father, but also she just has this deep desire to make healthcare available to everyone, to have equity between genders, to make sure everybody has access to food, to shelter, to water. And those were exactly things espoused by the communist movement. It sounded really good to her. And so she becomes a communist. And in university, she's a communist. And we see that that leads to a whole lot of trouble. But as Homa matures and as Homa grows up, she leaves the communist movement. She remains a political activist because she still believes in all those principles and she fights for rights. And then particularly as Iran becomes more fundamentalist for women's rights, but she leaves the communist movement because she becomes a bit disillusioned by it, but she remains a political activist in other ways.
And you juxtapose her devotion to all of these ideals and these dreams of becoming a judge, becoming something great. You juxtapose that to Ellie's dreams of wanting to become a mother and wanting to get married.
Yes. I wanted to show they have very different ambitions in life. Homa really just wants to make the world a better place, like literally. And she wants to be a judge. She wants to finish studying law. She wants to influence the laws. She wants to change the laws. She wants to really just roll her sleeves up and work to make society better. And Ellie wants to be a mom. She desperately wants to be a mother. And part of it stems from her own childhood, where she lost her father when she was 7. She was an only child. Her own relationship with her mother is strained. Her mother is, shall we say, a narcissist. She's quite a piece of work. And that was a fun character to write, let me tell you. Ellie wants to be a mom, but we see how both of these women's ambitions are thwarted because when they're young, they can talk about these dreams and then reality takes over. And we know that there's a huge betrayal. It's an inadvertent betrayal in the friendship, but it leads to a rupture in the friendship. And then, as you said, Rachel, there's a betrayal by society to these women where they are betrayed, where their fundamental rights are taken away from them. And that, of course, affects what happens to them as they grow older.
I want to dig into this betrayal a little bit because I found it fascinating because if we look to movies or pop culture, we think of betrayal as this well thought out, well planned, masterminded moment in someone's life. They've spent all this time building up to it. And in the book, you show the betrayal is actually just a 10-minute conversation between two people where, one of the characters doesn't think about who she's talking to or what she's saying because she's really upset about something. She's emotional in the moment. She's not in her whole mind and whole body. And that just seems so realistic to me that this is actually the way most betrayal happens. You're not thinking when you're in that moment. And yet those 10 minutes changed the course of her life, of both of the characters' lives, and just sent the book spinning, sent their lives spinning. And I just wanted to hear you talk about how you came to that kind of betrayal and how you think about that.
Yeah, it was exactly what you said. I know that like in traditional Hollywood movies and all of that, betrayal is this long thought out sort of strategic plan. But I think in real life, a lot of betrayal happens inadvertently. It happens in the heat of the moment. And I wanted to show how Ellie, in that 10-minute conversation, she gives in to her worst flaw. Well, actually, it's even worse than that. She's trying to overcome her worst flaw. So you know what her worst flaw is, and everyone listening does because I read it in that first page. Ellie's Achilles heel, Ellie's terrible flaw is that she is a very jealous person. And she has enough self awareness as she grows from girlhood into adolescence to know she's jealous. She doesn't like the fact that she's jealous, but she has a jealous trait in her. And in that 10-minute conversation, she's trying so hard to not be jealous, to not be petty, to not sort of demean her friend, that she ends up actually talking about her friend in very glowing terms, but to the wrong person, about the wrong thing. She lets her emotions get the better of her. And I wanted to do that too on purpose because I wanted to show, look, she's trying so hard to be good to Homa. And even though her intention in this moment is good, she ends up ruining Homa's life. That happens in life. From the best of intentions can arrive so much pain and hurt.
And it takes us back to this idea of the fragility of freedom, the fragility of friendship. And I kept wondering, how do you apologize for something like that? How does Ellie possibly explain to herself or her friend or apologize for something you do in just a 10-minute conversation that you didn't even know what was happening?
She didn't know what she was happening, and she was 20 years old, so we can also give her the benefit of she wasn't grown yet. She was a university student. How do you apologize? She grapples with it for decades. She spends her 20s and a good chunk of her 30s thinking about how she could apologize, wanting to apologize, not getting the chance to, and they're estranged for some of that time. And then the truth is, I wanted to show that sometimes you say, I messed up, and you forgive yourself. And Ellie isn't able to do that, but the person who is able to do that for her is her fiance. It's Marjan. She, I'm not giving too much away. These aren't like major spoilers, but she ends up telling him, and he's like, okay, you're human. I still love you. And I really wanted to do that too because it was very important to me to show not just love between two friends, but to show love, a romantic love that is so true that it's unconditional. So he knows the worst thing she did in this planet. And he's like, got it. Still love you. Of course, I forgive you. And that has a huge effect on her. That changes her deeply to have that love in her life.
But just again, this fragility of how 10 minutes can change the entire course of your life.
And I hate to say it, but it can. 10 minutes of talking to the wrong person can change the entire course of your life and then some, right? It affected other people too. I feel we don't want to believe that because, especially in our Western culture, there's this huge sense of I have individual agency. I'm the captain of my ship. I make my fate. I make my destiny. I'm in control. But Those of us who have had access to cultures where it is abundantly clear that people don't have individual agency, because quite frankly, they don't, where circumstances other than your individual will dictate your life, I'm deeply aware of how little control we actually do have over our lives. And not to like get anybody too down, but that's just a reality that I recognize. And how do you live within those constraints? How do you access joy and deep comfort and happiness and a sense of control when you come from a world where you don't have that? You really don't in your life, especially if you're a woman in Iran today.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Marjan Kamali, and we are talking about her brand new novel, The Lion Women of Tehran. Marjan, can you talk about the title? What does it mean?
Ooh, the title, The Lion Women of Tehran. So, Lion Women is a literal translation from a Persian phrase, Shir Zan. Shir means lion, Zan means woman. And I grew up hearing this phrase. It is often said when one is referencing strong women, powerful women, fierce women, women who are unstoppable. So I grew up hearing this phrase and I found it very empowering. And quite frankly, I have been surrounded by lion women. So the women in my life, you know, are not meek, they're not submissive. The Iranian women in my family are very opinionated, very strong, very vocal. So the Lion Women of Tehran references what Ellie and Homa originally hoped to be when they're little. I would argue what they end up being in very different ways. Very different ways. Even when that agency is taken away from them, denied them, when circumstances are beyond their control, when tragic things befall, they try to remain lion women, each in their own way, in very different ways.
You've been out with this book for a little while now. You've had a chance to do a little bit of your book tour. You're starting to get some reactions. So it's clear that this book is about Iran, that you're going to stand up and talk about Iran, the history of Iran, politics. And I'm curious, what sorts of reactions have you had from crowds? Are people talking about politics? What's it been like being out there and talking about Iran today?
It's been surprising because you would think the book is about Iran, but it is very much so, but it's also about the US. So I am incapable, Rachel, of writing a book about just Iran or just the US. Because for me, the two are intertwined and forever will be. You could argue that too is the story of a ruptured friendship. That too is the story of two countries who were besties until they weren't, and now they're estranged, to say the very least. But all three of my novels take place in Iran and the United States. And I don't think there will come a day when I can write about one without writing about the other, because if you're someone like me, your entire identity is made up of both, like not one or the other. But that being said, it's true. I talk a lot about Iran and its history. I was all over this country. I was on the West Coast. I was in the Midwest. It was my first time in the Midwest. I was in Wichita, Kansas City, Franklin, Indiana, St. Louis, Missouri, places I had never been to. And what shocked me was how much people could relate to these characters, how they appreciated learning about Iran, but they also felt like they were learning about their own childhood friendships, recalling their own friendships. They would share with me their own childhood friendship story. Boy, do I have a lot of messages about childhood friendships. And when we were in person together, gathered in an independent bookshop, people would always inevitably raise their hands and say, I worry that this could happen here, which, as we mentioned earlier, no one could have told me that would have happened, nor would I have wanted that to happen, because I preferred it when I wrote about these things happening and people in the US said, can't even imagine. And now, sadly, they're like, yeah, I can imagine. You know what? I sure can. And that's kind of sad to me because I didn't want that to happen here.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing that you've had a book tour like that, though. A lot of authors don't get that kind of book tour. So congratulations.
Yes, thank you. It was an old school book tour, like from back in the day. And it was not something I expected, but it was very, very rewarding because as you know, when we're writing our books, we're very much alone. And in my case, I don't even have a writing group. I'm literally sitting in my office alone with the characters, with the door closed, with the shades down. It's very much a cave-like situation. So then to go out there and talk to people about Ellie, about Homa, about the food they ate, about their mothers, yep, and their other friends and their lovers, it was like, hey, you guys, you know these people? Because I know them. Now you know them. That's so cool.
So are people in Iran able to read this book?
I'm sure that it's made its way as everything else does. Things make their way there. There is what's supposed to happen and then what actually happens. And so much of books published in the United States, movies that come out in the West, music that's released in Europe and the US makes its way there. It makes its way there and through the internet and through what have you, copies taken in suitcases, people get access to what we're reading, what we're watching, what we're listening, even though it is all officially verboten. But people have their, sidestepping of those things.
So publishing is a long journey.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about the journey of this book? How did it start? You're laughing because it really is a long journey, I'm guessing.
It's so long. It's a long journey that takes 3,000 years. My first book was published when I was 42 years old, and I started writing the minute I could. When I learned to write, I started writing stories. Even before that, I have a stapled together, onion skin, paper thin, tiny booklet that I dictated to my mom when I was 4, and she typed it up on her Persian typewriter. So that's my first published book, by the way. But yeah, it's a very long journey, it takes forever. Though once you're more established, it takes less time. So my first novel took me over 10 years to write, but once that came out, the ensuing books took less time because it was a bit different than when nobody's waiting for anything. So this book started off, Rachel, as an entirely different book. I was writing a book about 4 suburban mothers who had their firstborns applying to college in Massachusetts. And I wrote 125 pages of it. And sometimes to chat, they would go to a cafe called Miss Ellie's Cafe. And there came a point where I was like, I don't care about these mothers. I don't care about their darn children. I most certainly don't care about where they go to college. I could not give a flying fig about where they go to college. Why am I writing this book? And then I realized I'm writing this book because I started writing it. And then I thought, no, I'm absolutely not. And then when the pandemic began, I was scrolling Instagram, and that's when I saw posts from my own childhood friend in Iran, the friend I had had when I was in 4th grade in Iran. And just seeing her face again brought up all those memories we were talking about, that visceral, physical sensation of the friendship. And I realized I wanted to write about a broken friendship. And so I chucked those 125 pages and I pulled out the cafe owner. The cafe owner was an elderly Iranian woman, and I just made it her story. I made it about her friendship and her backstory, and it became a book I wanted to return to every morning. And that's how you know, isn't it? If you're not compelled, the reader sure won't be.
So did you reconnect with this friend? I love that story.
We are friends on Instagram. And as anyone knows who follows me on Instagram, it's hard not to know about this book because obviously, especially during the first month when it just came out, I was posting about it a lot. So she knows about the book. She knows I'm a writer. I don't know if she knows I talk about her in my interviews. But one day, I'm gonna summon up the courage to message her and tell her, I'm talking about you in my interviews.
Maybe she'll listen to this.
Maybe she will. Maybe she will. Quite frankly, she might. It's almost like a reconnection that I am so grateful for. I don't want to rock the boat, but I think she would be tickled pink Can I tell you one little tiny anecdote?
Please.
So, as you know, the book opens with Ellie at age 38 working in that Manhattan department store, Bloomingdale's. She has just received a letter from her friend Homa. And Homa, after many years of being estranged, and Homa says, call me, it's urgent. And she writes her phone number down. And that phone number is my friend's actual, well, it was her phone number when she was a child, because I still have the invitation to her birthday party, and her phone number was on the invitation, and I put it in there. That being said, the invitation is from 1981, so I don't think I'm like doxing my friend. I don't think that's even how numbers there work anymore. But anyway, it's those little tidbits we do that are fun for us as authors, right? Only you and me and the listeners of New Hampshire Public Radio know that that is her actual phone number.
Our very close friends, 25,000 friends today that are listening.
Yes, yes, now they know. Yes.
But it just goes to show how personal this book is and how your heart is really poured into every page here.
Every page. And another tiny cameo is I did a Stan Lee and I put myself at age 22 in one of the pages. So when Ellie and Mehrdad, her husband, moved to America, they moved in the late 70s, and Mehrdad works at Rockefeller University. And one day Mehrdad is showing his wife his new digs, and he's so proud. This is where I work. This is the lab, blah, blah, blah. And they open the door to the main office, and there's a small administrative assistant there who looks beleaguered and very sad, and she's 22. Well, that's me, because I used to work at Rockefeller University. Obviously not in the late 70s, because I wasn't 22 then. I worked there in the mid-90s, but I stuck myself in. And the description of that office and the description of the administrative assistant is 22-year-old me. So I thought it'd be fun to do a little joke to myself and to you and the listeners of your radio show now.
That's amazing.
I don't talk about those two things very much, FYI. So, yeah.
Well, I love hearing about it.
That's a credit to you.
I love it. So I understand that you have both an MBA and an MFA, and that you got them about the same time, right? You were taking the subway uptown, downtown in New York, going to Columbia and NYU for the 2 degrees.
Yeah.
So you have both of them, and now you're a writer. Talk about that.
The things we do when we're trying to avoid what we're meant to do. I wanted to be a writer. I dreamed of it. I craved it, but I felt like I had to be a professional. So yes, I got an MBA, but my dream was to be a writer, and I lived that double life for a few years where I was uptown getting the MBA, downtown getting my MFA, which is what I really wanted. And it took me a long time to reconcile and to just live my true vocation and dream. Sometimes we have a zigzag line to where we need to be.
Yes, we do. What advice do you have for new writers or aspiring writers?
Well, I'm teaching a whole bunch now at Brandeis University, and what I say to them is throw away the clock. Life is long. I think a lot of young writers want to be published, want to be published, want to be published, and they forget that sometimes you have to cook. You have to grow into it. You have to let life happen to you. So I tell them to be incredibly patient, and I also tell them to read and read and read. And then, as I said in class last week, when you wake up in the morning, don't look at your phone.
That's some good advice. Marjan, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's been an absolute pleasure to join you today.
You're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio, and we've been talking about the brand new novel, The Lion Women of Tehran, with Marjan Kamali. You have been listening to Check This Out, a literary series, which is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the Howe Library in Hanover, New Hampshire. We dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. I'll be back next week with my guest Morgan Talty discussing his new novel, Fire Exit. Make sure to check it out. Our producer today is Jessica Hunt. The Howe Library Director is Ruby Simon. NHPR's Program Director is Emily Quirk. The show is sponsored by the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation and the Howe Library Corporation. I'm Rachel Barenbaum, and we'll be back next week at this same time with more conversations. Remember to go to your local library and check out all the books you hear about here, or go to your local bookstore and buy a copy. Thanks for listening.